The last couple of years have given us some major news stories pertaining to the makeup of our union. There have been major pushes to grant statehood to places like Guam, Puerto Rico, and even Washington, D.C. We saw a referendum in California to split the state first into two separate states and then into three separate states, and Washington state even had a referendum that flew mostly under the radar to split that large state into two smaller states as well. But this past week, I was alerted to a headline stating that the Illinois Republicans had introduced a push to separate the city of Chicago from the rest of the state, and this immediately caught my attention. Now, as I've observed the government over the last few years and talked more to people who also observe the government, we've all come to the consensus that Washington, D.C. is very slow, if not unwilling, to add new states to the Union at this time. It would change the makeup of Congress, and that is a topic for another video. But with that in mind, if this were to go through Springfield for any reason, that would mean that Illinois would have to have another option for what to do with Chicago. Most of the news articles that I've seen pertaining to this have suggested that Springfield Republicans want to see Chicago made into its own separate state, and it certainly does have the population to do so. However, conversations that I've had with other people who pay attention to the federal government suggest to me the fact that Washington, D.C. right now is very slow, if not completely unwilling, to add any new states to the Union. And a part of this is because it would change the makeup of Congress, not necessarily the balance, but definitely the numbers, and that's not something that they're looking to do right now. So without statehood, Illinois would be looking at other options to what to do with this city. And one of the options that I ran across almost immediately is the fact that Chicago and its surrounding areas could be sold to a neighboring state. As we see from this map that was provided by Wisconsin Public Radio, Chicago has already been a part of Wisconsin once. But when Illinois applied for statehood in 1818, Free State advocates were looking at the fact that Mississippi had just been admitted to the Union a year before as a slave state. Now, the southernmost part of Illinois was more southern than most of the rest of the territory and would possibly have been admitted to the Union as well as a free state. But annexing 50 miles out of Wisconsin, moving the border up, and adding Chicago to the state made the state into a free state instead and balanced the power back out. In addition, Additionally, having a major shipping port in the fledgling state meant that the agricultural and manufacturing industries of the new state had a leg up over their landlocked neighbors that were also just being admitted into the Union. But times and infrastructure have changed, and having a major shipping port is no longer a make or break in a state that enjoys many of the major interstate highways in this country as corridors to trade goods with other states. With that in mind, it would not be difficult, if any of this were to ever go through, for Springfield to go back up to Madison and say, hey, do you want those 50 miles back? And given the fact that we have just elected a Democrat governor who is going to be looking for more votes in the future, I don't see any situation, if this ever went through, where he would say no. Now, I've driven to many places in the land of Lincoln, and I can tell you that as you go further west or as you go further downstate, Illinois becomes almost unrecognizable from the booming metropolis that it's best known for. In fact, most of the country only ever sees Chicago when they think about Illinois, and that's just not the case of the largely agricultural state. If you ever get a chance to drive through Illinois to go down the 39 corridor or go anywhere other than Chicago, you will see the fact that most of the state is dominated by prairies and rolling cornfields. In fact, it's almost indistinguishable from its neighbor Iowa in some of those aspects. Before I opened up the first article to start reading about this topic, I already knew where all of them were going to go. Because downstate Illinoisans are making this push for one simple reason. They are vastly underrepresented in Springfield, the state's capital. Illinois state laws are heavily representative of the problems or ideas that are native simply to Chicago, and possibly to Rockford as well, and this includes guns, taxation, and manufacturing regulations, among many other of the hot topics that are going on around this country right now. Looking at this map shows as well why residents of the more rural areas of Illinois are so frustrated with their neighbors to the northeast of the state. I'm not going to say that if Chicago were to apply for statehood and it were to get it, that the majority of Illinois' 20 votes wouldn't go with Chicago. In fact, 16 of Illinois' 20 votes would most likely go to the new state. But there would still be representation for the rest of the state. In fact, the rest of the state would be heard in national elections for probably one of the first times in the state's history. The proposal coming out of Springfield is a demonstration as to why our country fights to keep the representative institutions in place. The Senate and the Electoral College have been under attack ever since Trump was inaugurated because it gives disproportionate representation to smaller states across the country, but it does ensure the fact that the people of these states do get heard. And the majority of downstate Illinois is in a position where they do not get heard across the country. All of their laws, all of their regulations, and all of their voice in D.C. belongs to one small city on the northeast corner because it sits on the lake and it attracts the most people. And we're in the same boat across the rest of the country. If we were to abolish or disband the Senate and get rid of the Electoral College, all of our decisions would be made by New York and California, and indeed Chicago as well. The Great Compromise made it possible for smaller states and smaller demographic regions to get their voices heard in a large faraway government, and it's important that we look at the example of the state of Illinois when we consider whether or not to get rid of these institutions or keep them. The proposal by Illinois GOP is a long shot, and that's not only because of the majority representation of Chicago in Illinois' legislature. In fact, mechanically, this would be completely different than the proposals that were put in place by states like California and Washington. In both of those cases, the majority of the states were looking to secede from the capitals of those states and go off and form their own states. They were going to leave the capitals and some of the major urban centers to these states, Los Angeles and San Francisco in California, and Seattle up in Washington. But the difference being now is that the capital of Illinois is attempting to separate itself from an independent and autonomous city. And it's the same argument that many people in upstate New York are having when they talk about separating New York upstate from New York City. It's a lot more difficult to excise a city from your capital than it is to excise yourself from the capital of your state. For now, this is simply a proposal to get a referendum put on a ballot, and there's no legislation that's attached to it, and there's no real clear-cut plan as to how to make any of this happen. And in all honesty, this is a proposal that has very little chance of seeing the light of day in a legislature that's controlled largely by Chicago. But there are independence groups out in Illinois, groups that want to either separate Illinois from Springfield and Chicago, or want to separate Chicago from Illinois itself, and they would have no problems rallying support to their cause. But once again, this would be all dependent on any of this passing Illinois' legislature. So, for now, this is simply a news story to bring attention to the fact that this is happening. But let's not forget to take away the lessons that we need to take away from an event like this. Without representation, the minority is rising up to make sure that their voices are heard by any means necessary. And this is a principal building block of this free country. What do you think about Illinois' proposal, and what do you think about states separating in order to represent more of their populations? I always welcome a thoughtful and positive discussion in the comments section below, and especially over on Twitter. That is at EdsBlogTwitter with a 1 in place of the I. Thanks as always for listening to this show and supporting this channel. And remember, never take the words of bloggers, podcasters, or journalists as gospel. Find all the facts and draw your own conclusions. Take care.